My guest today is Mr. Andrew Tarnowski, a British historian, journalist, writer. Polish radio is currently celebrating 90 years of activity, being one of the more seasoned broadcasters in Europe, and not only. And you are one of the guests of honor at the major events. There's a valid reason for this.
Yes, I am the only grandson of the founder of the radio, Zygmut Jaxa-Chamiec, who was not only the founder but the first managing director for the first 9 or 10 years of the radio's existence.
A legendary figure here at the company headquarters, and not only, a true Renaissance figure, I would say. He studied economy. He studied even medicine in Strasbourg. He was an opera lover, also being the director of the opera for 2 or 3 years, I believe. He played the piano. Very gifted, talented person, but above all, a very efficient businessman. He indeed was one of the founders of Polish radio, and as you said, the first managing director. And he did a splendid job at that. But these are the historical facts known to everyone who studies the history of Polish radio, how it all began those 90 years ago. But what kind of a person, to your knowledge, was Zygmut Jaxa-Chamiec as a person?
Slawek, there are an awful lot of questions in there that you've just asked me. Legendary, you say he's legendary, but actually he would better be known as the forgotten man of Polish radio. He was kicked out by the Polish government in 1936. He lost all his investment. He became a pauper almost as a result. And he tried other careers afterwards, but they didn't really succeed. Then he was in Warsaw during the uprising. And after the war, the communists didn't want what you call a Renaissance man in charge of any radio, so they wouldn't allow him back into the radio. And he was an uncomfortable figure for all that time, in fact, until more or less the present day. Yesterday, I was very honored because the chairman of the board of Polish Radio invited me to attend a wreath laying at Zygmunt Jamiec's tomb. And that was the first time since his death that Polish radio has so honored Zygmunt Jaxa-Chamiec. So between 1948 and 2015, that's a long time.
Well, indeed it is. All I can say is that, that's what happened to a great many people here in Poland, a great many fantastic, outstanding men, women, figures of pre-war public life. And at the same time, I can express my happiness that finally we have lived to the times when we can see a return of such people as Zygmunt Jaxa-Chamiec. Have you ever had the opportunity of meeting your grandfather in person?
I never met him, no. I feel in my heart I've met him. I feel in my heart I know him, partly because of this wonderful book written by Richard Miazek about 10 years ago, which is the first book written about him and absolutely brilliantly done.
One of the managing directors of Polish radio back in the 90s.
Right. He did an excellent job. And yesterday at the wreath-laying ceremony, I was extremely moved. I thought it was simply wonderful. And the chairman said some very generous words about Zygmunt Jaxa-Chamiec. So I agree, yes, he has reappeared in Polish radio. And the chairman, in fact, said he's now an important figure. And I think that word you used, Renaissance man, is important too. It wasn't only that he had many accomplishments as a person, but I think his personality was such that it cast, I believe, a sort of benign eye on everything that happened here. I think he was very good to his employees. I think he wanted radio to be a constructive element in national life, a constructive element between different peoples. Remember, 1920s, 1930s, this was the rise of fascism, the rise of Stalinist communism. This was not an easy time, but he made Polish radio, he made sure Polish radio was a link, cultural and educational link for the Polish people and between Polish people and other peoples. And he refused to allow it to be in any way a national propaganda machine, which I think is rather why the colonels got rid of him in the 1930s. So yes, he was a benign figure, and he looks a benign figure in that marvellous portrait by Stefan Norblin, which his colleagues gave him when he was kicked out of the radio in 1935, and which now hangs, I believe, in the conference hall of the radio.
Yes, it does. Yeah. His fascination with radio, maybe it did not begin, but it reached, a certain peak in 1924 when he traveled to the U.S. and he witnessed the great boom of radio stations over there, which practically from, let's say, 20-odd at the start of 1924 reached a number of well over 300 in a matter of months. The same started occurring here in Europe, and hence the thought of organizing something which would reach out to people, to the masses, as we would say later on. So indeed a concept of what we presently call public broadcasting. In this sense, he was a visionary.
He when he was in the States, I believe it was, he met Marconi, Guglielmo Marconi, who was one of probably the great pioneer of radio in the world. And I think that's how he got excited about it. At the time, he was with the Polish peace delegation, or before that, he was with the Polish peace delegation at the Versailles Treaty to settle the issues of World War I. But yes, he was a visionary. I believe he also certainly considered the issue of going into television, even back in the 1930s. He definitely was. He was a man. He was a creator, a man who I've heard him called one of the builders of modern Poland, and I suppose in a sense he was. As for the radio, he got a lot of foreign capital involved in order to set it up. I was reading in an article by Richard Miazek yesterday that at that time the Polish state budget was the same size as the Berlin city budget in about 1930 something. So you can imagine how difficult it was to set up a radio. And yet he set up, I think, the most powerful radio transmitter in the world. At that time. Yes.
Well, indeed, best proof of the success of Polish radio under Zygmut Jamiec's leadership was the fact that, the company started out with a very modest capital of 2,000 zloty, the equivalent of roughly $400 at that time. And in a matter of months and successive years, it grew to, exorbitant sums. He was also very instrumental in securing a state tender for a state broadcaster. This happened, roughly 6 months after the initial test transmissions here in Poland. And this was also a success because, Polish radio, it was called that way from the very start, was the underdog in this tender, and everyone was surprised. Now, the recipe, so to say, for this success had been the fact that he drew into this act a very powerful consortium, a power-related consortium of various companies, and this inclined the decision-makers to point the finger at Polish radio, which was a 100% capital-owned venture. Truly Polish venture. So again, we're coming to the point where we can safely say that he was a visionary who simply wanted Polish radio to be Polish.
I had in my possession for many years a rather aged brown piece of paper, which was in fact a telegram form from, I think, 1925. And it's a telegram that Zygmunt Jaxa-Chamiec sent to his wife, who was then at the Rabka down in the Tatra Mountains, announcing that we have won the license for Polish radio. And I gave that to Polish radio when I gave them the portrait as well. I actually thought that he did get a lot of foreign capital involved in setting up the radio, and that must have been quite influential in persuading people that they had the finance they needed.
This was to support the initial initiative, so to say.
And, I see. Yes.
So it was quite a complex venture, but all's well that ends well, right. And this means that Polish radio was there to stay as one of the leading broadcasters, not only in Europe but also in the world. A very merited company nowadays. Walking down the corridors of the headquarters here in Warsaw, do you feel at home?
Do I feel at home? Well, this is my second visit, and I'm looking forward very much to seeing where the portrait is hanging and to attending today's. I feel very honoured to be invited to today's events. I'd like to say that one thing, my grandmother, Zygmunt Jaxa-Chamiec's widow, came out of Poland in the 1950s, late 1950s, about 3 years after Stalin's death, I think. And sometimes she would talk about her husband, and she referred to him as such a man as a king. He was that sort of a man. She was absolutely in awe of him. There was one story I heard that, in fact, was told to me by his nephew, Andrew Tarnowski in London, which was how he was kicked out of the radio, and the colonels wanted to take it over. So they sent a couple of men round to talk to him. They said, well, Mr. Jaxa-Chamiec, we really think you should surrender your position, and it would be very advisable for you to leave the radio. And he said, not at all. I have no reason to leave at all. Thank you very much, gentlemen. There's the door. Which was fine, except they came back sometime later and said, it really is time for you to go now. And if you don't, we have a camp called Bereza Kartusza, where you will be sent if you do not leave. In other words, he was threatened with being sent to Poland's only concentration camp in the mid-1930s as a way of getting to leave. So Andrzej Chamiec's description of this, he said, Grandfather Mush, he said, he shrugged his shoulders, he said, what could I do? In other words, he wasn't a man who would fight useless battles. He was a man who accepted reality and with a certain amount of detachment. And I find this very, very attractive about him. What else can I tell you about him? Not a very great deal, really, as a personality. He was meant to be a bit of a skirt chaser when he was young, a man of great charm, apart from intellect. And it was said that all the brains in the family had gone to him. Nobody else in the family had brains, apart from him, apparently. But I don't know much more, really.
Well, his charm is underscored on various occasions, both here at the company and also in private encounters. Best evidence of this is something I would like to present you with. You just mentioned the telegram that you gave to Polish radio as a token of remembrance of Zygmunt Jaxa-Chamiec. I, in turn, being interested in Polish radio history, had the very good fortune and luck that, several years ago, a mysterious envelope arrived on my desk. And when I looked into it, there was an anonymous donation, so to speak. This is a business card of Zygmunt Jaxa-Chamiec.
Let me have a look.
The managing director of Polish Radio, with a handwritten note, a thank you note for flowers received on his name's day. There's no addressee of this, and I also do not know in whose possession this had been. But many years ago, this is yours.
Oh,
Something for the Family History Archive.
that's really lovely. Thank you very, very much.
My pleasure. I'm just sorry to say that I cannot help you in the origins of this. As I said, this simply arrived on my desk out of the blue.
Yes.
Now, knowing fully well who Zygmunt Jaxa-Chamiec was, I placed it neatly in my drawer with other radio memorabilia. And knowing that we will meet today, I thought that this would be a suitable gift.
That's very, very nice of you. Thank you very much.
For the occasion.
I'm very moved.
Thank you very much for finding the time for our meeting.
Thank you very much. Something that just occurred to me is the impact he made on people. As I said, his colleagues had this Stefan Nordblin painting done of him as a farewell gift. But also, after he died, they used to put an announcement in the newspapers in Warsaw, I think in Życie Warszawy, every year on the day of his death. And they would go to his grave in Powązki Cemetery each year and lay a wreath. And this I think went on right up to the 1970s. I have some of the announcements in the papers somewhere, which I find very moving that he was so much remembered and liked.
Indeed he was, and as I said, I'm happy that, finally the times have arrived that Zygmunt Jaxa-Chamiec is back with us with the due respect that he earned through his arduous work and efforts in launching Polish radio, as I said, one of the best broadcasters in Europe, and not only. Thank you again. My guest was Mr. Andrew Tarnowski, the grandson of Zygmunt Jaxa-Chamiec, the legendary founder and managing director of Polish radio 90 years ago. I'm Slawek Szefs.